Welcome to episode number 2 of The Open Ground. Today's episode on the Modalities of Thought, a Perpetualist examination of cognitive misalignment and structural critique. Before we begin, a small meta-reflection on the prerequisite for discourse. Before any discussion can proceed, before one offers judgment, analysis, agreement, or dissent, there is a single prerequisite that must be confronted: modal recognition. To engage in any philosophical, political, or intellectual exchange, right, without first identifying the modality of thought that structures the other's position, is to participate in a form of epistemic negligence. It is to treat cognition as monolithic when it is, in fact, architectural. This recognition is not a gesture of politeness, it is not deference nor indulgence. It is the minimal act of intellectual legitimacy. Without it, what follows cannot rightly be called dialogue. It becomes, at best, the imposition of one modality's criteria onto another structure. At worst, it becomes the systematic erasure of depth through the demand for immediacy. Perpetualism holds this as foundational. Before you speak about a thinker, you must have entered their architecture of thought. Before you critique a position, you must have traced its modality, identified its rules of coherence, and recognized how meaning functions within it. This does not guarantee agreement, but it ensures that disagreement arises from understanding, not presumption. Without this step, discourse is performance. With it, discourse becomes an act of structural integrity, where critique is not a display of self-assurance but a reflection of earned comprehension. And only from that space can any philosophical project begin in good faith. This is the prerequisite. Everything else is premature. I will start from here. This is not an essay about Jordan Peterson, nor about the correctness of any given philosophical claim. It is an examination of the deeper failure, one that occurs not at the level of ideas, but at the level of how thought moves, builds, and coheres. What we are witnessing in much of modern critique is not a collapse of truth, but a refusal to confront the architecture of cognition itself. The inability to engage another thinker is not always a matter of disagreement. Often, it is a matter of modal blindness, of applying a flattened metric of clarity to systems that do not seek empirical resolution, but symbolic cohesion. This essay proceeds with one aim: to examine the conditions under which critique becomes possible at all, and the modalities of thought through which understanding, or its illusion, is constructed. For perpetualism, the issue is not whether we agree, but whether we have earned the right to disagree, and that right is not granted by opinion, but by structural fluency. The fallacy of flat critique. Critique presumes access. It presumes that one can not only identify what is being said, but also how it is being said, and more importantly, why. In contemporary discourse, this presumption is rarely earned. The prevailing mode of disagreement is not analytical, but reactive, a surface-level contest between conclusions, severed from the structural intentions that shape them. When a thinker like Jordan Peterson speaks, what is often heard is not his meaning, but a translation error, an interpretive fracture born from the critic's own epistemic position. His statements, drawn from recursive symbolic systems, are too often assessed as if they were linear propositions in need of empirical defense. This is not a disagreement of views, it is a misrecognition of form. The modal failure here is not peripheral, it is central. Thought does not emerge as a singular unified substance. It operates in modes: recursive, analogical, dialectical, empirical, mythopoetic, and others. These modes are not stylistic variations, they are epistemic architectures. Each carries with it its own grammar of coherence, its own metric of validity, its own horizon of intelligibility. To assess a mythopoetic structure using empirical standards is not critique, it is epistemological trespass. And yet this trespass has become the norm. This failure is not merely an error in approach, it is a philosophical violation. It reflects a deeper cultural impatience with complexity, a hostility to layered structures that do not yield to rhetorical ease. To demand clarity on one's own terms is to insist that thought only has value if it conforms to the interrogator's architecture. But perpetualism refuses this collapse. It insists that engagement precedes evaluation and that before one can judge a position, one must first map the modality in which that position arises. There is no shortcut. To critique without this mapping is not an act of insight, but a performance of certainty built on unearned coherence. The critic who demands that Peterson just be clearer often fails to ask, clearer to whom? Clarity is not a universal condition. It is the product of alignment between cognitive structure and linguistic form. When a thinker speaks through symbols, archetypes, and recursive abstraction, to insist on empirical sequence is to misread the genre of their mind. It is akin to critiquing a fugue for lacking a thesis statement. And yet, this misreading is ubiquitous because structural fluency is rare, while rhetorical confidence is cheap. This is not a defense of Peterson. It is an indictment of a culture that treats interpretation as an entitlement, rather than a responsibility. To disagree well, one must first enter the structure of another's thought, not to accept it, but to understand its internal coherence. Otherwise, critique becomes mimicry, gesturing at disagreement while remaining blind to the object it claims to address. This is the fallacy of flat critique, the illusion that a disagreement in content is meaningful when the form itself was never apprehended. Modal architectures and the illusion of universality. What is often called thought in contemporary discourse is not thought in its full dimensionality, but a constrained enactment of a single modality, usually analytical empirical rationalism. This mode, inherited from Enlightenment epistemology and reified through institutional norms, operates through linear sequence, falsifiability, and syntactic clarity. It is not invalid, but it is only one possible configuration of thought, and to mistake it for the standard against which all others must be measured is a philosophical parochialism so deep it rarely names itself as such. Peterson's architecture, whether one agrees with its conclusions or not, does not operate within this mode. His system draws from symbolic recursion, psychodynamic layering, and archetypal narrative, modes of thought that do not build from premises toward conclusions, but recur, re-symbolize, and anchor meaning through vertical integration rather than horizontal justification. These structures resist paraphrase precisely because their meaning is not reducible to propositions. It is enacted through form, rhythm, and symbolic economy. To engage such a system, one must recognize that different modalities possess different criteria for coherence. An empirical claim demands consistency with observed phenomena. A symbolic claim demands structural resonance within a mythic or moral frame. A dialectical claim demands internal contradiction to generate synthesis. A recursive claim demands the reappearance of a pattern across interpretive layers. None of these are interchangeable. To judge one by the standards of another is not only unproductive, it is metaphysically incoherent. Perpetualism names this breakdown not as an accident, but as a structural inevitability within a culture that equates comprehension with flattening. The demand for instant clarity, just say what you mean, presupposes that meaning should arrive decontextualized, stripped of depth, shorn of modality. But this demand is a refusal to think, for thinking, in its fullest sense, requires entry into another's frame, not as a tourist, but as a structural inhabitant. Only from within can one judge the coherence or failure of the architecture. From without, one judges only one's own ignorance. And herein lies the deeper fracture. The critic does not merely fail to understand the thinker, they fail to understand that understanding itself is modal. The moment critique assumes a universal frame of validity, it becomes a gesture of epistemic colonization. It assumes that its own architecture is transparent, neutral, and entitled to adjudicate all others. But this is the illusion of universality, and every illusion, once mistaken for a right, becomes a weapon against thought itself. Perpetualism does not claim that all modalities are equal, but it insists that modality must be recognized before value is assessed. To reject a thinker on grounds that do not apply to their mode of operation is not disagreement. It is dismissal dressed as critique. It is a philosophical sleight of hand that conceals its own limitations behind the veil of rhetorical competence. What is needed is not more critique, but more cartography. Before one evaluates the argument, one must map the terrain, its peaks and pressure points, its tunnels of recursion, and its symbolic weather. This is the demand of perpetualism, that we confront thought in its plurality, not its convenience. And in doing so, we may earn the right not only to critique, but to understand what critique even requires. The misreading of meaning. God is conscience as a case study in modal misalignment. When Jordan Peterson says God is conscience, the common response is either confusion or derision. Critics interpret this as theological sleight of hand, or worse, as rhetorical evasion disguised as profundity. But these reactions reveal less about Peterson's meaning and more about the architecture of the interpreter's cognition. The problem is not the claim itself. The problem is the expectation that such a claim should submit to empirical or propositional analysis. This expectation is not neutral, it is modal, and when applied indiscriminately, it becomes a tool for invalidation rather than engagement. To say God is conscience is not to assert a fact, it is to enact a symbolic condensation, a deliberate fusion of moral intuition with metaphysical anchoring. Within the symbolic hierarchical mode of thought, this fusion is not metaphor, but structure. This statement functions not to describe the world, but to orient within it. It is not asking to be tested, it is demanding to be inhabited. Like myth, it does not disclose its coherence at the level of logical sequencing, but at the level of existential recognition, of resonance across narrative, psychology, and moral intuition. To expect such a claim to behave like a scientific hypothesis is to misread the rules of its own internal grammar. Critics often mistake this for obfuscation. They demand clarity without recognizing that clarity is conditional, and that some claims resist flattening, precisely because their function is to sustain tension. The symbolic mode in which Peterson operates holds its meaning not in simplicity but in layered integration, where myth, psyche, and tradition converge to reassert moral structure without submitting to the severance of modern rationalism. To mistake this for incoherence is to misdiagnose structure as noise. It is the philosophical equivalent of criticizing a poem for lacking data. This is not to excuse Peterson's framework from criticism, but to criticize it effectively, one must first enter its system, trace its symbolic recursion, identify its anchoring metaphors, follow the psychodynamic threads that interlace its moral architecture. Without that effort, what emerges is not critique, but epistemic imposition, a demand that all thoughts submit to one's preferred grammar, regardless of the thought's own integrity. That demand is not philosophy, it is intellectual coercion. Perpetualism intervenes here with a structural corrective. It does not defend the content of Peterson's statement, but it insists that its modal identity be recognized before its meaning is evaluated. In the absence of that recognition, disagreement is a misfire, a collision of architectures mistaken for debate. The real question is not whether God is conscience is true or false. The question is, what mode of thought does this claim belong to? What are its criteria for coherence? And are you willing to meet it on those terms long enough to critique it with precision rather than projection? Until this becomes our standard, most philosophical conflict will remain a theater of misunderstanding. We will continue to watch one mode of thought dismiss another, not because it has exposed its weakness, but because it has refused to see its form. The perpetual tension between clarity and depth, between flattening and recursion, cannot be resolved by declaring one mode supreme. It can only be navigated by recognizing that thought, like reality, is plural, and that critique, if it is to matter at all, must be earned at the level of structure, not performance. Structural fluency as ethical prerequisite. Perpetualism does not grant the act of critique as a default posture. It withholds that right until a prior condition is met. Structural fluency. The ability to speak against an idea is not legitimized by one's conviction, rhetorical skill, or moral certainty. It is legitimized only by having entered the architecture of that idea, moved through its hallways, climbed its symbolic stairs, and understood why its foundations were placed where they were. Without this fluency, critique becomes not just premature, it becomes an act of violence against thought. To critique a claim like God is conscious without structural fluency is to participate in an epistemic fraud, to pretend one has understood a system one has not entered. This is not a minor offense, it is the very condition that gives rise to most of our cultural stalemates, where opposing sides are not arguing different conclusions from shared principles, but operating from entirely different cognitive blueprints without acknowledging the mismatch. And yet, in the absence of this acknowledgement, each side performs critique as if it were dialogue, unaware that what it enacts is dissonance mistaken for debate. The ethical failure here is subtle but devastating. It is not that critique becomes too harsh or intolerant. The failure is that the grounds for judgment are never made visible. One assumes a position of critical authority without ever confronting the limitations of one's interpretive apparatus. This is the intellectual equivalent of declaring a text incoherent because one cannot read its language, and then blaming the text. It is a collapse of humility disguised as analytical rigor. Perpetualism demands another stance entirely. It insists that before one critiques, one must ask, what modality is this thinker operating within? What are the rules of coherence inside this system? What does failure look like from within, not just from without? This is not a demand for relativism. It is a demand for earned judgment, for disagreement that arises after one has borne the labor of entry rather than before. This labor is not optional. It is the ethical prerequisite for any engagement that seeks to claim legitimacy. To fail in this task is not simply to misunderstand, it is to become complicit in the very conditions that render genuine thought exchange impossible. The intellectual world, under this view, is not a battlefield of right and wrong, but a landscape of architectures, each with its own logic, blind spots, and load-bearing assumptions. Critique, then, is not demolition. It is structural assessment, a confrontation with what holds and what collapses once the internal logic has been honored. To disagree without this labor is not disagreement. It is theater. It may sound like insight, but it performs ignorance. It signals engagement, but delivers dismissal. And this is why perpetualism holds structural fluency not as a luxury, but as a moral imperative. Because the absence of that fluency leads not to conflict, but to the illusion of understanding, in a world that no longer knows how to ask if it has earned it. Perpetualism, under perpetual scrutiny. It would be intellectually dishonest and philosophically incoherent for perpetualism to demand structural fluency from others while exempting itself. Any framework that asserts a pluralist epistemology must, by its own terms, remain vulnerable to the very modalities it seeks to account for. To claim that one's system escapes misreading is to presume a universal readability, an assumption perpetualism explicitly rejects. Therefore, it must confront a deeper truth, that it too can be flattened, misread, or dismissed when encountered from outside its modal grammar. This is not a danger to perpetualism, it is its design. The crucial equilibrium, its philosophical core, is not a balance between competing truths. It is the living tension between internal coherence and external opacity. Perpetualism does not resolve this tension, it lives inside it. It understands that every structure, no matter how dynamic, generates blind spots. Every epistemic frame, once spoken, once written, produces shadows. These shadows are not errors, they are the price of articulation. And it is precisely this awareness that permits perpetualism to maintain a posture of perpetual openness without surrendering structural rigor. To make this operational, perpetualism must submit to the same test it asks of others. If it is to be critiqued, the first demand must still be structural. What mode is it operating within? Perpetualism does not merely assert that thought is plural, it thinks plurally. Its grammar is not linear, but recursive. Its coherence emerges not from fixed definitions, but from the interplay of modalities, each held long enough to expose its limits and cross-contaminate the others. The system is not closed, but scaffolded, built to be climbed, not sealed. To critique perpetualism, one must navigate its architecture as architecture, not as rhetoric. To reject it because it does not conform to another grammar is, again, not critique. It is the repetition of the very failure this essay names. This recursive demand is not philosophical indulgence, it is the cost of integrity. In a time where systems are dismissed by the speed of disagreement, to require modal mapping before evaluation is to reintroduce intellectual accountability. And while that demand may slow the pace of critique, it restores its legitimacy. It recenters the act of thinking not on winning, but on witnessing thought in its own form before offering its counterstructure. Perpetualism must therefore remain incomplete by necessity, not because it lacks clarity, but because it refuses finality. Not because it cannot be pinned down, but because it insists that any pinning must begin with orientation, not conclusion. This is the recursive ethic of structural fluency, to make every engagement not a performance of comprehension, but a confrontation with the question, have I entered this structure deeply enough to disagree? Only then is critique not a closure, but a continuation. Only then does thought fulfill its function, not as a tool for judgment, but as a modal act of co-presence with what another mind has built. The shape of critique in a modal world. If structural fluency is the prerequisite and modal mapping the method, then critique, genuine critique, ceases to be a tool for discrediting and becomes instead a discipline of navigation. It no longer functions as a verdict delivered from a stable platform, but as a traversal between systems, each with its own gravitational rules. The critic becomes not an adjudicator, but a translator who first learns the terrain before offering terms of departure. This does not weaken critique, it renders it accountable. In a modal world, disagreement is slowed, not silenced. But this slowing is not obstruction, it is calibration. Perpetualism does not seek to eliminate tension between systems of thought. It seeks to make that tension intelligible before it becomes antagonistic. It does so not by diffusing difference, but by demanding that it be understood on its own terms first. And once that is done, once a system has been entered, its architecture mapped, its coherence tested from within, only then does critique regain its rightful posture, as a structural challenge, not a performative dismissal. This is the deeper ambition of perpetualist inquiry, not to replace one epistemic modality with another, but to confront the necessity of coexistence, even among systems that resist commensurability. To think is no longer to position, it is to move between positions, to learn how a claim functions inside its home structure before relocating it to one's own. And if relocation proves impossible, then the act of critique becomes one of witnessing the limits of translatability, not of collapsing what cannot be domesticated. Critique in this context becomes a form of humility, an acknowledgement that some truths are modal, that some insights do not survive export, and that the desire to universalize understanding is often a mask for domination. Perpetualism does not reject critique. It dignifies it by raising its cost. It insists that the right to disagree is earned through modal empathy, not intellectual shortcuts. And it sees in this process the beginning of something rarer than consensus, a field of co-presence, where minds encounter not just claims, but the conditions that made those claims possible. This is what the modern critic must learn, not how to be right, but how to arrive. And arrival is not measured by confidence or conclusion. It is measured by whether one has stood long enough within another structure to feel its gravity before choosing to leave. Only then is disagreement no longer the beginning of distance, but the proof that thought still matters, because it still resists collapse into the familiar, the immediate, the flat. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. Until next time.